My name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. I have been traveling the last few days. I thought I could do what I'm doing work-wise while doing these spaces while on the road. It was obviously a lot harder than I thought it would be. So I'm instead doing 3 back-to-back spaces today. This one's with Chris Martenson, who's got a great following. I think should be a really interesting conversation. Chris, for those who are not familiar with you, talk about who you are, how'd you get involved in markets, and what are you doing now?
Great, thanks. And thanks for the invite, Michael. Hey, welcome everybody here to this. It's great to be here with you, and real pleasure. What's my background? So I have a PhD in pathology from Duke University. I was a researcher for a period of time, discovered that researching was interesting, but it wasn't as broad as I like to be. I went and got an MBA and worked in various corporate positions for a while. I was in corporate finance at Pfizer for a period of time and ended up as a vice president at place called SAIC on the commercial, not the defense side. Eventually, I gave all that up to start a blog, and that was back in 2006-07. I was heavy shorting home builders and mortgage insurers and other things because I thought I saw a pretty tremendous bubble coming. 2007, a little painful for me. 2008, it all turned around, got validated pretty heavy. And somewhere in there, I developed a point of view about, I'm a broad person. I like systems level views. So I started putting together this idea of, hey, where are we with respect to energy in this world? Not a US story, but a global story. How does finance actually work? Deep dive into how our debt-based money system works and how it likes to exponentially expand all the time. It's either happy or unhappy. And then pulling all that with where we really are environmentally with respect to resources. And so I stitched all that into a story called The Crash Course, put that out in chapters in 2008. Stupid is really bad. It's a terrible product. It's some dude, me, speaking over a bunch of slides, but it really resonated. It caught on. It got translated into 12 languages, viewed tens of millions of times. And suddenly my blog became my mission, became my money. So I've been operating that website called Peak Prosperity ever since then, since 2009. And been doing this, which is talking about where the world's going and how I see it. Departed heavily to talk about COVID for the past couple of years because my background gave me some insights into that. That attracted a lot of new followers to the way I parse the world, which is, I call it common sense. So I'm a little bit of I'm all over the map, but I don't consider myself an expert in any one thing, but actually that's both my weakness and my strength. I think we have to look across these different disciplines so that we can integrate them to have a chance at understanding what's happening. So that's my background in a nutshell.
I'm curious, Chris, is there any part of corporate America that you miss?
No. Not even slightly. I was so ill-suited for that, Michael. I'm really just, about 3 years out of it, I was a ruined puppy. There was no way I was ever going back to that environment. Not a chance.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've been an entrepreneur pretty much my whole life, and I've never really experienced what it's like to work in a big corporation. But those that have and then leave, they seem to be much happier in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's me for sure. And I'm such a huge entrepreneur at this point in time and facing insurmountable opportunity at this point in time. And I've raised all my kids to be entrepreneurs. And I'm a big believer that it's all about where you add value. And if your value is, you know how to shift in the political winds, you'll do fine in corporations. I just, as a contrarian, I did poorly at that game. I care about the truth more than politics. I care about what's right versus what's expedient. And so I was a bad fit anyway. It was just, that was an experiment that was not going to last. I was successful at it, but feeling much happier out here in the real world.
So let's for a moment focus on that word truth, because that's an interesting word in today's environment, because truth should not be debatable. But yeah, as a songwriter, there's a lyric I have out there in one of my songs, which is, "Why does the truth change every day?" It's one of my great frustrations when listening to the media and all the constant spin around the economy and politics, that the truth is never the truth. It's always just an interpretation of one's beliefs in the current environment. Let's talk about seeking truth for a moment. How do you go about trying to discover what's real and what's not? When you look at the world, when you look at politics, when you look at the economy, when you think about and parse all these different dynamics, what process do you yourself use? For me, it's always very simple. Go to the source and don't be emotional. But there might be more to it than that.
Well, it's a great question. And this is the topic I'm really passionate about. And so let me start here. I don't know what the truth is. I've got a world-class BS detector. So that's what I start with. It's kind of like that Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that did not bark, often I start with the piece in the story that doesn't make sense, right? And so sometimes people call it common sense, but I'm just really good, Michael, at figuring out when I'm being lied to, right? So in this most recent construct, I know the Fed lies to us, I know the CDC does, and listen, it's just what institutions do and all of that. But if you can begin to expose where the story is wrong, you have a real chance at figuring out getting closer to the truth. Now, as a scientist, here's a quick example. I was taught 100% that Darwin won the debate, right? There was this whole nature versus nurture. Is it Darwin? Is it this Lamarckianism? And Darwin wins, right? It's just survival of the fittest. It's just a machine. There's random mutations. That's how DNA works. You pass your random mutations that have fitness to your children, and that's how things work. Well, that's what I learned. Now I know that's complete junk. Our DNA is in constant communication with the world around us, that you can actually have experiences that get passed on to your offspring. We know this through the Dutch women who experienced starvation during World War II, and they had children who were known as the fat children. They just stored calories. Their body said, we have to store calories. It's an emergency. That's the world we're being born into. We know that mice that are shocked can pass that PTSD-like experience on to their offspring in response to a stimuli. In this case, it was experiments done around the scent of cherries. That whole thing it's just wow. So my mind has been blown, and that's where I approach everything in this approach towards truth. Truth is a journey. We get closer and closer to it. I don't know that we ever arrive. I don't think we do. But you can always be making progress towards deepening your understanding. And that's the approach I take. So I will definitely develop fairly firm opinions, but if new data comes along, as you say, dispassionately, if new data comes along to make me have to rethink that, I'll rethink it in a skinny minute. It's kind of my superpower. I'm very flexible that way. Strong opinions, I can back them all up, and they're subject to change. So that's my process.
Right. I think that's sort of the dilemma. The truth is only a function of what's available, right, in terms of the underlying data. But there's constantly new data, so the truth is, get maybe reinterpreted in different ways as new information comes out. Now, I love the name Peak Prosperity, and I love that you put that out in 2009, because there is an argument that prosperity really did peak, before the great financial crisis. But I'd like you to talk about how you interpret the truth behind what happened post-great financial crisis. Is the truth that we are still recovering from that, and that everything we're seeing inflation-wise is due to all of this excess of stimulus that really started post-Lehman Brothers, or is the truth something different? I want you to lay out sort of where we are in the cycle of progress and the cycle of capitalism here.
Well, I'd love to, and I'm going to have to rewind further. I'm a huge context guy. So I see the great financial crisis as just another layer on a cake that we have to go back a lot further. So little known fact, my grandfather, Arthur Hamlin, was and his father before him, all presidents of a regional bank in upstate New York. So my grandfather actually got to serve under the New York Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker. So I heard a lot of stories, and I consider Paul Volcker kind of like the last great moment in Federal Reserve chairman. To me, where this all began to go off the rails is when you look at overall GDP growth, which I consider to be sort of a loose approximation for our national income, as it were, our earning power. And then you look at wealth generation as a second line. And if we have those two lines on a chart, they begin to depart pretty badly. And they'd always been coincident, as of course they should. Your wealth and your income ought to have some relationship to each other. And where do they go off the rails? I think it begins with Alan Greenspan. It starts in 1987 with that first crash, and oh my gosh, we have to intervene. It's very rare. It's just an emergency. And then that emergency, well, then we had the tequila crisis emergency in 94, which bled into a corporate bond crisis, which led Alan Greenspan to then step in and did this little arcane weird thing known as implement the sweeps program, which basically removed all reserve requirements from banks at all, effectively. A lot of arcane detail there, but that really set the whole stage for what we saw in the 90s, right? So we got the internet explosion and boom. That's great, and created some awesome technology there, and we made some bad investments. And then you had to intervene again in 1998 with long-term capital management, another bailout. And then we started to see this, I believe, the enshrinement of moral hazard in Wall Street, which is like, listen, if you're going to fail big, really big. Systemically big. Wall Street's smart. They took that to heart. And then, of course, we had 2000, another intervention. We had our 1% blowout rates. through Bernanke that brought us into the housing crisis. And then, of course, we had the 0% interest rates and Janet Yellen's constant interventions. And here we are today. To me, it's just one long, big series of interventions. But if you follow that long sweep, I think our car on the national highway began to skid in 87. There was a little correction on the wheel, a little overcorrection. We had to correct the other way in 94. Now we're really oversteering. 98, 2000, the car is really pitching. 2008 was just yet another of these vast overcorrections and increasing levels of intervention where the Fed used to intervene never, then once, then more frequently. And I'm now at the point where I see basically it's a very constant series of interventions from the Federal Reserve and their proxies. So that's the world I see us in. 2008 didn't fix anything. They papered a lot of things over and left us with a lot of deep, deep structural imbalances that never got addressed. Namely, we'd financialized 40% of our economy. You can't do that. And we were building wealth on top of our perceptions of wealth, increasingly layering that on top of what was a hollowed out actual economy. Because I'm this kind of guy. If you give me GDP, I'll tell you that I think real is not as high as they say because we undercount inflation. I'm one of those people. And secondarily, I think that to have a true sense of your GDP, you have to back out debt as a consequence. Because, I mean, listen, if you had a GDP of 100 grand, I have a GDP of 100 grand, and I borrow 50,000 and I spend that next year, in classic measure, my GDP went up 50%, right? Did it? Well, not if you ever think you have to pay that debt back. So the longer sweep of all of this was from Greenspan, we come to this weird conclusion that we can just exponentially accumulate debt forever and we'll never have to pay it back. And I don't believe that's true.
So I shared in the nest here on the top here, Chris, this tweet I put out that it wasn't the great financial crisis of 08 that started this. It was the Iraq war that started this. So I don't disagree with you on sort of the longer term outlook, but or longer term context. But to me, the Iraq war is really what kind of started this spiral of debt, but also abdication of thinking. I remember very well watching, I think it was CNN back in, and when the Iraq war was starting to get into the media as far as maybe going in and getting Hussein, that somebody said to me, said on the newscast, well, if the president says that they have weapons of mass destruction, I'm going to believe him. And that was a really disturbing comment to me at a very young age because it suggested that we got to a point in society where we don't question things anymore. We don't question what authorities are telling us. And that really, I think, is where you end up having this idea that the government is the one that should tell us what to do and help us more than us helping ourselves. Do you think that period has any sort of real consequences, longer term, sort of the after effects of the Iraq war? If this is sort of an element of what we're seeing here is a function of just a broader issue as far as how we view government and how we think about money?
Yeah, great question. I don't think the Iraq war did anything that hadn't been done before, but it changed the inflection of the curve on the graph pretty strongly. That was an era that I was actually very involved in, and I'm this kind of guy. They were telling me, my congressmen, senators, and the president were saying there's these WMDs, and I actually went and read this thing called the UN SCOM report, right? There were all these inspectors. They went in there and they said, look, nobody just makes VX out of nothing. There's very complicated machines. There's precursors. These things are all bought out of Europe or the United States or other places like that, and we have the receipts. And they added it all up, and you came to the end of it, and they couldn't account for about 5% of the total machinery and input stocks, and those might have got blown up during the Iran-Iraq war prior. So I looked at all that, and I knew for a fact my BS detector was pegged, that this idea that there were mobile labs with hundreds of thousands of tons of this and that was BS. It was completely just a lie. Watching how many people bought that lie, though, and watching the facility with that, today we're just in the same extension of that same behavior, which is, we're being fed a bill of goods that I think is false. Now, listen, you go and you attack a country and you do all of that, and you can always rebuild if you have sufficient energy to do that. We're at a totally different part of this story now, where from a resource standpoint, I look at where we truly are in terms of oil in particular. And I say, how much is there? What do we know about? No speculation. I'm not one of those people like, oh, they capped these major wells. I'm like, great, show me the data and I'll incorporate that into my view. What we know about today, says that we don't really have the latitude to make big glaring errors, either from an infrastructure standpoint, from a war standpoint, you name it. And so when I look at that, I do think that, that era told me that something changed, and it changed for the worse. And at that point, I think we were maybe just prior to that invasion under G.W. Bush into Iraq. And in a 2-month period, Alan Greenspan had visited the White House more times than all prior chairmen of the Federal Reserve collectively had visited the White House up to that point. So through all of time. So we saw in that 2-month window this heavy politicization of the Fed's being used as a helpful narrative control signaling arm. Obviously, you want your markets to signal, happiness with the invasion, which they did. You definitely want, it became about the narrative and more than the reality. And so that's the larger sweep of what I've been fighting in my own life here. And when I, set myself up in my website, I'm basically trying to clue people in as best I can to this idea that it's okay to live by a narrative as long as your narrative comports with reality at some point. You gotta square that back up at some point. We haven't done that as a nation, and now we're fully in the grip of people who are just about the narrative and not about the reality at all, which means it's about ideology. And listen, if you have tons of energy, you can make lots of mistakes, have all the ideology you want. It doesn't matter. However, we're not at that part of the story. This next 10, 20 years is going to be an extraordinary departure for not the US, but on the human species when you understand it at the resource level. China's comporting themselves with that reality. Russia's busy doing that. A lot of countries are. We're not. Europe's not. Canada, Australia, New Zealand as tag-alongs. That's how I see it now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you hit on, like, most of my my timeline on Twitter is sarcasm around narratives, because I always say narratives follow price, and narratives are not necessarily a truth, although it's very good at making us believe that that's the truth. All right, first of all, let's lay out the argument for peak oil as you see it. But then, if we are at some kind of cycle of peak oil, does that mean that we almost have to be at some kind of cycle peak for debt as well?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I got a lot of economic data and charts, and the chart I have that if somebody said, give me your 1-minute thesis, it's simply one where we got x-axis, y-axis. Along the y-axis, we're going to show total energy consumed by the world, or we could put oil on that axis if we want. And then we would put across the bottom, we would say GDP. So when you look at that chart, what I love about it, going across decades, like this chart goes back to the 40s, what you see is almost a virtually straight line, right? There's really it's got a R squared of like 0.98, right? It's just like a straight line. You draw through every time you have a little bit more economy, you're burning a little more energy. So the relationship between economy and energy is really, really tight. And it's very clear. Now we could lay that out as well by how much energy do countries consume and how big is their GDP. Again, a straightish line, very, very flat connection there. So listen, it shouldn't be hard to understand, but we all grew up in an era where there was so much energy, we didn't have to think about it. It was like water to a fish. But if we can start with this beginning assumption, I got a lot of data, I could, prove it out, that the economy grows if and only if it has more energy access to it. And the opposite of that would happen as well. And we would know that intuitively, right? If you went out, honest to God, and just sat near an airport and asked yourself, how much of these things that I see happening around me are because of oil? The honest answer is all of them, right? Literally all of them are happening. Even me walking across the parking lot, I'm walking oil, because if you look at and trace down the use of fossil fuels and the production of fertilizer and the planting and the harvesting and the transporting and the cooking and the storage of food, it's all just woven in there. It's just embedded in a way most people don't see and don't have to see because it's just been there the whole time. All right, so peak oil is not a theory, it's just an observation. And I spend a lot of time in the oil field. I visit oil wells, I talk to people in the business, and you poke a hole in the ground, and if you're lucky enough, you hit something, and it hits a maximum flow rate, and then despite all your best efforts with end of oil recovery efforts, steam injection, water injection, you name it, carefully managing that reservoir, it loses pressure and depletes and declines. Great. It's just a thing that happens, and it happens to one well, and it happens to a collection of wells in a field, and it happens to whole countries. So that's where we are in the story. Is peak oil's really, it's an observation. It's not a theory. What would be a theory is how much oil has been as yet undiscovered. different concept. But the idea that any given field has a maximum amount that you're going to get out of it and it's going to decline at some point is just an observation. So I differentiate observed fact from hypothesis from theory. So observed fact is that's just how this stuff works. Great. So the big question, the open question has been, if you look at it now, there are really only 10 countries in oil that you have to understand and know about. And we all know the big ones, right? So yeah, we've got Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the rest of, say, the Persian Gulf region, Libya, Venezuela. These are the last few with the big open amounts, and Russia and the US. Right? So the most important article that I've seen this year, and there have been so many, probably came out 2 days ago, and it was in Bloomberg, written by Javier Blas, who's just an awesome energy and resource tracker writer for Bloomberg. And the title of that was Saudi Arabia reveals oil output near its ceiling. So Saudi Arabia has been very cagey about that. Now they've said, yeah, we think 13 million barrels a day, but that's it. That's all we think we can do. I think they're still being evasive. I'm going to wait and see if they can even get to 11 million barrels a day, which they've done twice in all of history and couldn't hold it for that long. I'll be a convert when they hold 11 million barrels a day for, say, 90 days. And then I'll watch and see if they can get to 12, right? Personally, I'm skeptical they can get to 13, but it's an opinion. But still, Saudi Arabia came out and said, hey, we've got a peak. We can see it. Last year, Russia announced they hit their own peak. They announced that officially in the Commersant. China announced that same thing in 2017. So we have all these countries out there that have recognized it. Europe and the United States have been very resistant to the idea. And it's a narrative that's been actively militated against, as it were. And if you work in the EIA, there was one guy who worked there a while back. He actually mentioned the words peak oil, got canned instantly. We just don't tolerate those thoughts here for whatever reason. Now, there's only a couple of reasons that you can actually continually increase your indebtedness. One is if you are continually lowering your interest rate. I think we kind of ran out of room on that. Yeah, we'll see what happens with CBDCs where they can actually take that firmly into negative territory. But, we had an experiment with negative yielding debt across Europe and the world. I don't know what it hit, 19 trillion or something, some stupid number, but it is what it is. That kind of ran out of its natural room. So if you can't really authentically take your interest rates much lower than zero without getting into all host of trouble, different argument there, but let's hold zero as a reasonable bound. Your next option is you're going to have to just extend the maturity of that longer and longer and longer. So we saw that tried, right? Really dumb stuff, right? 100-year bonds in Argentina. Who bought those? Bunch of knuckleheads. Now, what's going to happen is I know that the financial system can't imagine anything other than actually continually exponentially expanding total credit aggregates. That's what we see in the data. You want to take the best data series out there for understanding this. You go into the Federal Reserve data set, look at TCMDO, total credit market debt. Starts about 1950 in this data series, and it is a perfect exponential curve from 1950 right on up to 2008. Perfect, like 0.99 R squared. It's like, that's what it is, growing exponentially. Second thing you'll notice when you take the derivative of that, it's been compounding at 8.9% per year ever since 1950. Well, that's weird because our economy's, even nominal GDP isn't that high. So our economy, in a real sense, at GDP level, has been compounding at half the rate of the debt. Now, this is just dumb. It's a math problem. It's like saying, hey, my income's going up 5% a year, but my credit card debt, which I never pay off, is going up at 10% a year. Listen, you have a problem sooner or later. The fiction has been, we'll figure something out. This will never come to us. So now here we are. It's going to be really, really hard to continue that exponential accumulation of credit. The world has been doing everything it can. Well, the world central banks have been doing everything they can to sustain that. And I don't think it can be sustained. So the question is, well, if that can't be sustained, what happens? And I think 2008 gives us a clue because that was the first time in that TCMDO data series that I can find where debt actually went backwards for about a year, well, just under. What happened when debt accumulation actually went into reverse? Well, according to the memoirs of Hank Paulson and Mervyn King of the Bank of England, the world's financial system almost completely crapped out and broke. We heard stories of CEOs of major banks taking cash out of the ATMs in their own lobbies because they were that worried. In other words, the story I have here is that if you use 2008 and that slight moment where debt went backwards as an instructive tale for those in power, the tale is this. If the system isn't growing exponentially, it's collapsing. It has two states, happily expanding or busy collapsing. So if you have a choice, you're going to make sure it continues happily expanding. So that's everything I've seen since 2008 is just literally a continuation of what can we do to keep total credit market debt expanding at a really aggressive pace. And the world has put on, I don't know how many tens of trillions of dollars since that moment. It's a lot. And so that's the model. Now we have to wander back over here to this idea that energy is the economy and that the economy is the thing that gives your debt any sort of value in the first place. Like, why would I want to hold Italian 10-year debt? What's Italy going to give me in 10 years, right? Going to have to give me something that's coming out of their economy. When you start to try and square that circle, you can't. You see that the amount of debt in the world is going to require an extraordinary amount of new energy to be discovered and brought online. Little complexity. It's not just energy. It's not aggregate. It's how much surplus energy can be brought online. This is the ESG green revolution where it flops badly. Hey, you can create a lot of cheap electricity, but it doesn't have a great return from an energy standpoint. It's okay, but it's not what we had before. And it's not going to sustain the world that gave us all this debt in the way that it's been constructed. So long, rambly way of saying, I see the financial system is unable to get out of its box that it's in. It's going to continue to do everything it can to pump, to print more, to get more debt out the door. And it's going to keep doing that, even though we're in the largest structural oil shortfall I've seen in all the years and decades I've been analyzing it. Fundamentally, we have a huge shortfall on our hands. And that's a different, larger story, but it has to do with the fact that from 2015, when oil cratered from 100 plus down to 30s, and then went negative a little later, whatever that means, we had about 6 years where the oil majors and miners didn't invest, really just didn't. No offshore, no big deep water stuff, none of that. And so we are not going to be able to bring on additional supply over this next number of years. If we really throw money at it, it'll be the next 3 years. If we sort of let markets sort itself out, it'll be 5 to 6 years. But I'm looking at a 3 to 6 year shortfall in oil supplies and activist interventionist central banks that are going to keep their printing up. That's the fundamental tension that's setting up here right now. And it's a doozy. And so that's my whole work in the world, is getting people kind of ready for that moment. To me, ESG is going to turn out to be one of the largest misallocations of time and capital in our broken narrative structure. It is Wall Street marketing, but it's also broken out of Wall Street and become a narrative machine that a lot of people truly believe in. And we're seeing that sort of ESG thinking get wrapped into corporations. And when I do see a corporation get wrapped around the ESG axle, I start to discount their future earnings heavily in my head. I think they're getting on the wrong track. Now, we've seen a lot of ESG. Probably the biggest country that really went up to its waist on this is Germany. They had their Energy VN program. They, decommissioned coal plants. They decommissioned nuclear. They have a lot of wind. They have a lot of solar. And of course, the problem with wind and solar is sometimes the wind doesn't blow and nighttime. And so now that we see what happened when their on-demand gas flows got cut off from the Russia-Ukraine conflict and all of that, Nord Stream getting taken down and all of that, what happened? Well, next thing you know, they're burning coal again, and coal is now once again right at the very top of its overall level of input to both climate emissions and the energy production. Coal. I thought coal was dead. That was the narrative 2 years ago. It's not dead. Here's why ESG is a scam to me. Humans are going to burn all the fossil fuels. Guaranteed. We can have all the fun, narrative, ESG, we love being green kind of things, fly ourselves to Davos and talk about how green we are, do all that. But when push comes to shove, people don't like being cold, and they don't like being stuck at home, and they don't like not moving, and they don't like not eating. So we're going to burn the fossil fuels, guaranteed. So that's why I don't really engage with the moral dimensions of this, because it's not a moral question. It's just practical. Humans are going to burn that stuff up, period. The question that would get a little interesting is, well, are we going to do anything useful? with that, because if we're going to burn it, we should probably say, well, we could do that. It has a unit of energy. We can use that however we want. And at the end of it, though, where are we as a nation, as a world? Where do we want to be? What's our infrastructure going to look like? And there, I think, at least the ESG conversation is starting to open us up to what I think we need to do, which is throw a lot of capital, but in new directions. I'm big on nuclear. I think there's a huge investment thesis around that, obviously, as well as there are some promising things I'm seeing in hydrogen. I think if we're going to go in a direction, that's going to be in a direction we're going to have to head in. But this whole idea that we're going to put up a bunch of solar panels and wind towers has just been revealed to be a fraud. That obviously broke, didn't work out for Germany. It's not working out for the UK. We're going to see an extraordinary winter of discontent in Europe this year. I don't see any way around that at this point in time. There's not any combination of LNG and new renewed pipeline inputs that's going to solve any of this in time. So Europe is going to be our first understanding of what happens when you take a complex system, which is what a global or a continental economy is, and you starve it for energy inputs. I'm not smart enough to predict the output. I can predict the direction, though. There'll be lower economic output, and things will get simpler. This period of time where if we don't manage our energy transition carefully and well and intelligently, this won't be a great reset we're facing. It'll be a great simplification, which is a euphemism for less economic activity, fewer job classifications, less standards of living, less everything. Almost like it would be a peak in prosperity. When I first put together the crash course, it came out in 2008. And the tagline I assigned to it, not to be overly vague, was the next 20 years are going to be unlike the last 20 years. And I put 20 years on it because I knew that this topping process for oil was going to be a big, long thing. And I think we're right on track. Between here and 2028, things are going to get pretty interesting. And it's possible that we'll see that 2018 was the all-time peak in what we call crude and condensate, which is the actual legitimate measure of this. They switched that all out, for narrative reasons. They started calling it all liquids, which is like, what's that? Includes ethanol, includes natural gas liquids, which are just a totally different beast, right? Nobody runs a jet or a large container ship on ethanol or natural gas liquids. It's irrelevant to larger economic considerations, but they threw it in there. Anyway, we're at the peak so far on crude and condensate, called C+C, is 2018. Will we get above that? I don't know that we ever will again, but I have to leave it open because the United States has not yet opened up the East Coast to drilling. A lot of Africa hasn't been explored yet. There may well be stuff up in the Arctic. I don't know. So I like to remain open to that, but it's entirely possible that this is it. And the other thing is the next layer of complexity under this, which is really important, and I alluded to it by saying it's about surplus or net energy, is that the oil that we're finding today, it's there, and the shale drilling it's genius. It's just, you go there, it's unbelievable. 1,200 truckloads of stuff for a single well, and they've got these 700 horsepower chained diesel engines just creating ungodly pressures, and the whole thing works, and they don't blow themselves up, and they do it over and over again. It's amazing. And, we might be drilling up to 20,000 total feet of well, doing 100-stage frac, getting 1,000 barrels a month that's 85% depleted in 3 years. And then you have to wash, rinse, repeat, and keep doing that. And that's where we are in the story. And the point of that is we don't get as much back for all that effort in. And so that effort back for effort in, that's the net energy. We're clearly sliding down the net energy slope. We're clearly at we're sliding down the net energy per capita. So here's an interesting point. A lot of people go back and go, oh my God, 1971, we came off the gold standard. Well, in 1970, the United States also peaked in conventional oil output. And this was the cheap and easy stuff, right? This was Prudhoe Bay, Spindletop, Gulf of Mexico, all that crazy good stuff, right? And that was also about the last time that a one income family could support itself. Well, of course they could. When you have lots of surplus energy, tons of things are possible. And ever since then, we've been coming down this slope of net energy from oil per capita in the United States. And yeah, we got the shale stuff came out. It's beautiful. I'm not diminishing it, but it ain't the same stuff. And so to me, one way we could look at this is, well, we came off the gold standard and we abrogated, the whole Bretton Woods II understanding, and we went down this debt-based printing path. And that was one part of the story. But the reason for that was because we had peaked in 1970, and this freaked out the power structure because they understood that connection. 1973, after some year or two of intense negotiation, Henry Kissinger had negotiated the petrodollar. Because if the dollar wasn't backed by gold, and a lot of people, gold bugs, go, oh, the dollar became unhinged from anything, and that's where it went bad. It's like, no, we hinged it to oil. That was an amazing thing. And the deal was, for a petrodollar, was like, hey, Saudi Arabia, you sell all the oil you want, but you sell it for dollars, right? And that was enshrined forever until now. And the whole world traded oil in dollars. I mean, if you're Peru and you want to buy oil from Kuwait, you need dollars. Where do you get those? Well, you have to run a trade surplus with the U.S. or with somebody who runs a trade surplus with the U.S. That was the story. It was fabulous. The dollar was backed for a long time by the U.S. military, which backed this thing called the petrodollar. Fantastic. That regime is now coming to an end. This is a really big deal. So I said there was a number of articles that made my eyebrows shoot up this year. Another one back in March, when President Biden first wanted to go talk to Mohammed bin Salman, he didn't even pick up the call because Saudi Arabia didn't even pick up the phone. Right, that is the end of the petrodollar era being sort of death knelled right there. And of course, Saudi Arabia, UAE are both very, very busy talking with President Xi of China, Putin of Russia. So that whole thing, if or when we see the dollar get unshrined from the petrodollar status, a lot of things change very rapidly for the United States. Wrap it back to the debt. We have a lot of debt and currency units outstanding out there in the big world. And if the world has less use for them or less interest, or God forbid, the petrodollar gets unhinged, we will see a lot of that circulating currency just have nowhere to go, nothing to do. We'll detect that as rising interest rates, falling dollars, rising commodity prices. So that's a really big sweep. And I don't know that it's possible. I don't know what's going to happen for sure after that 3 to 6 years of reduced sub-sufficient oil output. But it could well be that that's the high watermark, because to get the stuff that is remaining requires very complicated processes, super high technology. And if the world goes through a great simplification, it might just be that we don't have the technology available or the manpower or the resources to go and get it, in which case it's a self-reinforcing spiral. I just put this out to my subscribers a couple days ago as in response to this, to the Saudi Arabia admission. And so I'm a geek this way. I love the Dallas Fed does a great survey, and they survey all the E&P companies. And so here's a quote that came in from one of those E&P companies in the U.S. They said, quote, this is in the Federal Reserve minutes for this thing. I love this. Just came out this last quarter. Quote, the real energy crisis isn't even here yet. The U.S. Energy Information forecasts U.S. oil production to average 12.5 million barrels per day for the next 30 years. This is all but impossible. Shale will likely tip into terminal decline in about 5 years as the main shale plays run out of locations. Unfortunately, by then, most of the individuals with incumbent knowledge about offshore and international development will have retired. The brain drain in the industry will create a real and much larger crisis in the mid to late 20s, end quote. So that's from an insider in the business saying, look, we can now calculate in a spreadsheet the end of the shales play, because as I told you, that those things go into very rapid decline on a per well basis. So the question is, how fast can we drill new wells, which is a derivative of the question, how many acres are left? That's all easily calculated at this point in time. So we know that once we run out of drilling space, here right now, if the U.S. shale business stopped drilling this minute, in a year, we get 45% less output from the wells that are already in play. That's when I say a ferocious decline rate. I mean, it's a 45% loss in that first year. So we have to keep drilling just to hold things steady. The EIA out there informing the presidency and all the other administrations saying that they think we're going to get 12.5 million barrels a day for 30 years. Like, they don't have access to spreadsheets or something. Actually, I'm sure there are people in there that know that that's complete BS, but they're caught in a narrative machine and they have to say that. But it's actually not true. And so if you look now, who's the number one oil importer in the world? It's China by far. And they continue to import more and more and more every single year. So it's not unthinkable that if the U.S. gets into this sort of mid-20s, mid to late 20s, we're like scrambling. We don't have either the resources left to drill. We've got political issues where we can't like park rigs off of Santa Barbara for whatever reason, or whatever the story is. And we have to then compete on the open world stage for oil because we need to import again to keep our system running. We're now head to head up against China on that front. And so that's actually the larger part of the story that's really dumb. And the backdrop for that, which I think is treason, is watching the United States dishoard about 1 million barrels per day out of its strategic petroleum reserve. And I use that word ironically to, I don't know what, support midterm elections and export that oil to China. This is probably one of the dumbest things you could do. And we're doing it. And practically nobody is saying boo about it in the larger media structure. But it's absolutely horrifying to me what we're doing. I take what the price of money, which is really what a yield is at this point in time. I discount it a little bit compared to the past because it's so heavily distorted by central bank activity. I mean, we just saw the ECB say, oh, we're going to raise rates 0.5 point and we're going to accelerate our bond purchase program. Like pick one, right? So it's getting hard to sort of decipher those. But I take that, and even though it's discounted, I think there's a real signal there. It's very obvious that we're in a recessionary environment at this point in time. The GDP Fed now agrees with that. I think the employment data agrees with that. The absolute abrupt cessation of the housing market in many key formerly hot markets concurs with that. So I do believe that we're in a recessionary environment at this point in time. And what I do with that information is I actually think the Fed has to appear to be fighting inflation at least through the election. But shortly thereafter, they're going to reverse course. We see the Eurodollar futures and also the Fed funds futures both indicate that same idea that the Fed's going to, stop its rate hike cycle sooner than later and probably be in a cutting cycle fourth quarter this year, first quarter next year. So I do think that's going to happen. My approach to that is to say, be defensive. I think there's still better prices out there for lots of things. I'm sitting on the sidelines, but increasingly anxiously. And I do think that we're going to have to go into another major sort of quantitative easing, buy everything cycle, which may include equities this time, if the trial balloons hold that have been floated out there. But I think we're coming in for one last cycle. And by the way, this gets us back to that Ludwig von Mises quote of a country only either gets to voluntarily terminate its credit expansion cycle or face a destruction of the currency involved. Now, that's a strong statement, but I do think that my advice to people is run, don't walk. You take all your cash and cash equivalents and any borrowing you can affect when we get into that next loosening cycle. Just that's it. Just buy stuff. But I'm a real stuff kind of guy, not like buy, crazy derivatives on derivatives. I mean, I'm a hard asset person. I love land. I love trees. I love productive land. I love productive real estate. I'm a huge fan of many of the harder assets that you can get your hands on. I'm a fan of companies that are in the business of creating hard assets, oil companies, mining companies. They will all have, I think, an incredible run on this next cycle. But that's because the Fed's going to have to, I think, start printing again. A year tops from now, but probably half a year to 9 months from now.
Real quick, but that does tie into the name of the space, which is global social unrest, right? So maybe, Chris, if you want to riff on that a little bit, because I think there is a real concern that you will see more, let's call them uprisings, as a result of everything that's going on.
It's true. So this is my larger sort of framework I look through. If you look through resources, obviously the most critical resource for humans, besides oxygen, is food and water. And so when we look at what's going on across the world, we see a lot of these so-called food riots are happening. We saw it in 2011, right? We had the Arab Spring and all of that. The old saying is that every nation is about 9 meals away from anarchy, and we understand that at a fundamental level. As things get tighter and tighter on an energy standpoint, the degree to which we misallocate that and we use that energy, such as it is, to conduct wars or build giant buildings that, instead of feeding people, that's where we're going to see more and more of this social unrest. So to come back and the other question about inflation, we have structural inflation now, which the Fed and other central banks can't do anything about. The oil shortage falls. It's a very highly inelastic commodity. The price is going to go up a lot higher from here unless we have a capital D recession, depression, capital RD thing. I don't know. But this social unrest, we're going to see more and more of it. And we're seeing it. It's actually very underreported right now. I'm in close contact with people who are front lines with the Dutch farmers, but it's spread to Poland. It's in Germany. It's in Italy, North Macedonia, Albania. It's just spreading all over the place. And so that's level of popularism you're going to see more and more of that because the system is busy stealing that economic oxygen. Think of, I said the economic pie expands or contracts based on energy. If energy can't expand anymore, there's some tricks you can pull to make it seem like it's expanding, but that's really just pull demand forward, debt-based stuff. That ultimately ends up stealing economic oxygen because the pie isn't growing anymore. Then people who want their fair share or a bigger piece of it all the time, right, which we'll call that the financialized side, then that comes from somewhere axiomatically, and it's being stolen from the people who don't really have a good seat at the table. So these are farmers, the poorer people, et cetera. You can do that until the pain of their existence gets too big, and then they rise up. That's what I'm seeing right now. My model for that, which I talk about all the time over at Peak Prosperity, is from the outside in. We see the weaker countries get hit first, and we watch that start spreading towards the core. The thing I've been surprised about this time is the speed at which it looks like this is racing towards the core in Europe. Watching Germany's conniptions right now, they're already aluminum manufacturing plants are shutting down. They're already in a very, very deep crisis. And I don't see anything to stem that crisis right now because the political system is caught in a set of narratives that don't allow it to be effective at this stage. So my advice is for the people to get ready for more disruptions and more difficult times because our leadership they're just not even remotely aware of a lot of what we just talked about, I don't think. Or if they are, they're only privately aware of it, but they can't talk about it publicly.
Yeah, this was great. Chris, I appreciate the flexibility, given that I literally told you within 45 minutes that we should do this. Real pleasure, Chris. Really do appreciate it. And everybody enjoy the rest of your day if I don't see you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.